Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. I'm very pleased to be joined by Hadia Sheerazi. Hadia is a manager at RMI, the Rocky Mountain Institute, and has been working on industrial decarbonisation and stakeholder engagement, and specifically community engagement, and bringing in local communities into energy transition projects. Has a long career in the area, I guess, of energy and climate and policy. Over 7 years experience. So welcome, Hadia. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Nadim. It's great to be with you.
Obviously, there's been a lot happening in hydrogen over there in the US as there is in Europe. And I guess it'd be good to get your insight into what you see as some of the big challenges occurring in specifically in the North American context with regard to developing hydrogen. We're certainly seeing a lot of press, I guess, people maybe coming off the hype curve and getting into the nitty-gritty and some of the hard yards that need to be done now in terms of building these projects.
Absolutely, Nadim. I think that's a great question, and certainly from my seat at RMI, we spent the last year and change was very much about apply to get and to unlock millions and billions of dollars of federal funding that were flowing into ensuring that we had a secure, sustainable roadmap for a national hydrogen strategy. And we saw the exciting announcement for the 7 finalist hubs that are all around the country that are promising thousands of both construction as well as permanent jobs, and will result in boons and economic prosperity in many communities. Simultaneously, we are looking at the emerging the challenges that are quite real and that have yet to be resolved. And that, largely we're looking, if we were to look at 2 significant challenges that need to be overcome, particularly, I would say, for green hydrogen. First is we have yet to figure out the water stewardship question that is going to be central, particularly in the US context. We are still going through a mega drought that is quite severe and significant. Water utility debt is a reality for US households. We already have 1 in 3 households in the US that are struggling with energy insecurity, making choices between paying for food and medicine and keeping the lights on. And that becomes specifically challenging when there are households that are medically vulnerable. There are households that already, are they're young children that, needs to have the lights on to be able to study, or there are people that need to keep their food fresh. And so we have certainly a significant, the question of how do we manage the water challenge in the United States, given that desalination is certainly an option, but not a cheap one. It's not going to be cheap in terms of energy usage or perhaps in terms of land intensity. And then there are also questions around equity for water stewardship broadly. So that's the first one. And then secondly, we've got that question about pipelines. Pipelines have been a flashpoint in US history in terms of infrastructure development, very similar to how highways or railroads and a lot of large infrastructure was built in this country. And pipelines historically have had a history of being built on the back of eminent domain, which is deeply triggering for communities and has also had a history of certainly discrimination when we're thinking through the US context of, where pipelines were located. And so now as we think through the new blueprint for the clean energy transition, and the fact that this blueprint has to be co-created with communities that have been historically excluded, marginalized, and disadvantaged from, underinvestment and overburdened by legacy pollution, it becomes central that equity is firmly embedded in how we think through issues like water management, how we think through issues like siting and permitting, and how we think through specifically benefits of how are these communities going to have not just a small share in the extraordinary wealth and opportunity that will be created by these projects, but will continue to have a say in how these projects are deployed over the full life cycle. And so we're talking, about multi-year commitments by developers with communities to co-create the energy future.
I mean, you mentioned I guess, pipelines specifically, and I guess you're talking about, is it the sort of battleground between sort of state and federal and jurisdiction questions?
Absolutely. So that has been, an interesting thing that we're looking at, to say that it is a question that I think the federal government has posed to be resolved. It has to be resolved by the jurisdictional authorities. So typically FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, right, would be the highest authority, or would hold the ability to oversee, um, certainly under the Natural Gas Act, would have oversight over gas infrastructure. If
Mm.
hydrogen is blended into natural gas pipelines, then that oversight extends to hydrogen. But it is yet unclear how that operates on a state by state level, because certainly agencies like PHMSA, that look at the transportation of hazardous substances, and the Department of Transportation itself that looks to PHMSA for that
Yeah,
execution, right? They're looking to the states. And
yeah,
then states also, it's interesting, will certainly sometimes defer to local authorities for things like emergency response and management. And it's not entirely yet clear if how all of those procedures and standard operating procedures are actually flowing up, if there is consistency from state to state. So certainly we would not want to have a situation where there's one state that has a robust response, and there's another state that doesn't, or that there's confusion on who has authority when there are pipelines running through multiple states. And we're seeing those multi-state projects now
yeah.
not only being considered, but very much in the process of trying to obtain permits.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, certainly in terms of getting clarity on that, and as soon as possible. I mean, in terms of the water issue, and yeah, I mean, most of the developers we speak to have, saying, yeah, we've priced it in, but I guess it's the point is, it's not only about the costs, it's also about the sustainability of that process, and looking at what happens with the waste coming out of desalination, and brine, etc. Is that how you see it?
Absolutely. I think the issue can also be thought of in this way. The price of water that's priced into the models, it can be argued that that might not be the true cost of water, right? Because the water, the value that we place on water is not necessarily reflected in the price that is assigned to it when they're thinking through, particularly access to water rights, which could be grandfathered in. And so certainly when land rights are purchased, sometimes water rights are they're inherited under that purchase, but that may not necessarily reflect the true cost of water, particularly I think in states that are really going through it with the mega drought. And we
Yeah.
almost saw, states kind of get into sort of legal skirmishes. That was just like 2 years ago over the Colorado River.
Mm.
And so we're seeing very clearly that the question around water stewardship, long-term water management, is going to be important.
Mm.
Desalination, being an expensive option, is not necessarily going to be available to everybody. And then the energy that is needed to essentially make that work. Right now, we've got an issue with significant backlog for green electrons, that are affordable and that are available to make some of this real. And so I think that there has to be a very real conversation of what is possible, what
Mm.
is but profitable on the developer side, but then what is going to be just and equitable for communities that are dealing with both utility debt, and they're also dealing with water debt. And so answering these questions in ways that make sense for all the stakeholders involved, I think that's going to become critical for project success.
With your hat specifically referring, I guess, to community engagement, that's, I guess, critical from your perspective in getting them on board to help alleviate those issues. Is that how you see it? And also referring to, I think you mentioned the backlog for the supply of electrons being stemmed from a slowdown in the permitting processes for solar and wind. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes. And so, from my work at RMI has been very much focused on equity and community engagement, being firmly embedded in how we think about industrial decarbonization for the highest emitting sectors.
Mm.
And so that's a lot of times that looks like capacity building for project developers that are very new to the kind of energy equity, energy justice concepts that the Biden administration has been putting forward as priorities, national priorities. And the Department of Energy has, is firmly established as principles for how they, perceive the clean energy transition. And so a lot of this work, it comes from a perspective of communities first. From the developer's perspective, it's about de-risking their projects. Because right now, the three, kind of common threads of significant challenges that developers are facing in terms of local ordinances, permitting, siting, interconnection delays, right? For particularly in the US context, they're quite significant. And the third is firmly community opposition to projects for, particularly we're seeing for wind and solar. And they're significant. So Lawrence Berkeley National Lab did a survey of 123 projects across over 60 companies. And they found that just in the last 4 to 6 years, they have seen nearly half of those projects have delays and a third get cancelled. Significantly project delays, we're looking at 11 months for solar and 14 months for offshore wind. I mean, those are significant costs that can cripple project finance. Investors can pull out, and then we don't have the green electrons. And a key element, right, to unlocking permitting and siting is having community support and buy-in. It's having the positive public comments go in to the public register when public utility commissions, for instance, are oftentimes making these decisions. And if there is an outpouring of support versus, significant criticism or worse, lawsuits, that can be all the difference in getting a project over to the finish line and closer to FID.
I mean, I think, it makes sense if you think about it. I know someone explained around, the clean energy transition. So we're going from a system where we're really extracting resources in a very concentrated, manner in terms of extracting fossil fuels and having to overlay a very, very much bigger, impactful system of solar and wind, which covers a lot more land and thereby going to be encroaching and NIMBYism is just going to increase. And how do you turn that NIMBYism to, I think YIMBYism was an expression someone said.
Yes.
Yes, my backyard. I mean, simply put, what do you think is key to getting them on board? Is it really just does it money talks, getting them a seat at the table in terms of actually equity and participation, and they can see the benefits of the local project?
That's a great question, and I think that is right, the multi-million-dollar question for projects. It is all of those things. It is the first part of it is that the advice that I would give to any clean energy project, infrastructure project developers is to say, you have to go where you want it, right? You want to have the project ideally sited in a community that's excited about hosting that project because of the jobs it brings, because of the prosperity it brings, the opportunity it will bring, particularly in terms of creating pipelines for workforce development, right? We're looking at very systemic programs now that have offers for apprenticeship opportunities, that have the ability to bring in money for community projects like parks. And now, particularly in the US context, we need climate adaptation and resilience. We need hardening of shorelines and communities that are dealing with severe worsening heat waves year after year. And so there's a real opportunity to very strategically place projects in communities that have both the resources, so that's everything from the labor to the water resources to the land resources, access to the grid and interconnection, but broadly where there's a good match between what the developer can offer and what the community needs. And that sort of gets to that question of, when thinking through community benefits, when thinking through how are we going to share in the prosperity of this project with the local host community, the designing of those benefits, that those early conversations and even who's going to be at that negotiating table becomes critical. And so we have seen over and over in terms of case studies of recent projects in the last 2 to 3 years, developers that have engaged communities early and often that have been inclusive in that engagement, and that's two-way dialogue versus sort of an announcement that a project is coming, right, to a county or to a district or to your neighborhood, instead of doing that, that there was actually a discussion and conversation and public hearings and community support and consent, so affirmative consent, which is really important in these cases, and that there was thoughtful designing of that negotiating table. And that includes everything from ensuring that underrepresented groups, historically underrepresented groups, and so typically there were frontline, fence line groups, right, that are first and worst impacted by legacy energy projects, are at that table. That typically groups that have lower negotiating power in any context, right, whether they're the elderly, they're persons with disabilities, women and children, they're veterans, there are immigrant communities, there are minorities, and historically in the US context, if it's a BIPOC community, they have not been at the table in it as an equal negotiating partner. So that the creation of an equitable negotiating table goes a long way. And I think the last piece is thinking through responsive benefits. And that's really, really critical, because if a community is repeatedly saying that they're really concerned about their underground drinking water, but nowhere in the benefits is there a provision for protecting that resource, or perhaps finding ways or alternative ways to ensure that that water supply that's critical for that community's health is not compromised, those projects will not advance. And I've been seeing that around the country.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, there's a lot of points there, and as I mentioned, I think this issue is only going to grow and grow, and it's great to have your insight. Great to speak to you, and thanks a lot for sharing your comments today, and thanks a lot for the work you're doing over there at RMI. And you obviously just launched the stakeholder analysis mapping tool. So
thank you, Nadim. Looking forward to it as well.
cheers. Thank you, Hadia. Bye bye.